Part 1. The Pattern. I've hosted a true crime podcast for 6 years, and in that time I've covered maybe 40 cold cases, most of them tragic in the ordinary, devastating way unsolved disappearances always are, but none of them changed my life the way the Hollow Road cases did. I want to be honest, right at the start of this account, that I am not a detective, not a trained investigator, not anyone with any formal authority to have done what I ended up doing. I was a journalist with a modest audience and an obsessive streak, and that combination very nearly got me killed. My name is Junia Castellanos, and I run a podcast called Case Cold, produced out of a converted spare bedroom in my apartment with the help of my longtime producer and closest friend, Thaddeus Onwuka, who everyone calls Thad. We'd built a decent following over the years covering cases other outlets had moved on from, and I want to describe the specific rhythm of that work, because I think it matters for understanding how gradually, how almost accidentally, we stumbled into something considerably larger and more dangerous than anything we'd previously handled. Most weeks, our research looked like this. A listener submission, a records request, a handful of phone calls to family members willing to revisit their worst memories in service of some slim hope that renewed attention might finally produce an answer. It was, for 6 years, careful, methodical, largely unglamorous work, the kind that rarely put either of us in any real personal danger, however emotionally taxing it could sometimes become. It was Thad, going through listener submissions one slow Tuesday evening, who first flagged the pattern that would eventually consume the better part of a year of both our lives. The submission came from an anonymous listener who identified themselves only as a retired state trooper, someone who'd worked highway patrol along a specific 40-mile stretch of rural Tulane road that locals had taken to calling the Hollow Road. Not for any official reason, but because of how the terrain swallowed cell signal for nearly its entire length, a genuine dead zone running through dense forest and low, fog-prone valleys between two small towns that most people pass through only. Because the alternate route added an extra hour to any trip. The trooper's message was brief, almost clinical, but the list attached to it stopped both of us cold. 11 names, spanning 15 years, every one of them a person who had, according to official records, either broken down, run out of gas, or simply pulled over along that specific stretch of road and had never been seen again. I remember sitting with Thad in my cramped home office, both of us reading and rereading that list, the specific dates and locations laid out in a simple spreadsheet the trooper had apparently spent considerable personal time compiling, understanding. Even in that first reading, that we were looking at something that felt less like the ordinary tragedy of scattered disappearances and more like a pattern someone should have identified years earlier. 11 disappearances, along 40 miles of rural highway over 15 years, is not, on its own, an impossible statistic to explain through ordinary tragedy. People do vanish, especially in remote areas, for reasons ranging from foul play to simple accident to a deliberate choice to disappear from their own lives entirely. What made the list different? What made Thad slide his laptop across the table to me with an expression I recognized instantly as the specific excitement and dread of someone who thinks they've found something real, was the retired trooper's final line. Every single one of them called for help before they vanished. Every single one of them reported, to whoever they called, that someone had already stopped to help. Part 2. What the record showed. I want to walk through the research Thad and I did over the following weeks as carefully as I can, because I think the methodical nature of it matters for understanding how we eventually arrived at a name. And because I think it's important that anyone attempting similar research understand exactly how dangerous that process can become once you get close enough to something real. We started with public records, court filings, local newspaper archives, the handful of missing persons case files that had ever received any actual media coverage beyond a brief initial notice. I remember the specific tedium of those first weeks, hours spent in county records offices, requesting files under public disclosure laws, cross-referencing names against local newspaper microfilm that hadn't been digitized, building, gradually, a database that no single official agency had ever apparently bothered to compile in one place. That handled most of the digital research, tracking down social media accounts, old employment records, anything that might establish a clearer timeline for each victim's final days. I handled the human side of it, the phone calls, the difficult, careful conversations with family members who had, in some cases, spent over a decade wondering what had actually happened to someone they loved. Conversations that took an emotional toll neither of us had fully anticipated when we started. The pattern, once we started cross-referencing carefully, held up with a consistency that unsettled both of us more with each new confirmation. Every victim, across all 15 years, had experienced vehicle trouble somewhere along that specific 40-mile stretch. Every victim had, in the final documented communication anyone had with them, a phone call to a family member, a text message. In two of the more recent cases, a social media post mentioned that help had already arrived, that someone local, someone who clearly knew the road, had stopped to assist before any official tow service or law enforcement could reach them. And in every single case, once that message went out, the victim was never heard from again, their vehicle typically found abandoned somewhere along the shoulder, occasionally weeks later, sometimes with visible tampering to the engine that responding officers had. In nearly every case, attributed to ordinary mechanical failure rather than any deliberate sabotage. I remember the specific chill of realizing, going through case file after case file, that at least 4 of the responding officers across those 15 years had noted, in their own reports, some version of the same detail. That the described mechanical failures seemed, to their professional eye, somewhat inconsistent with the actual state of the recovered vehicles. Minor notes buried in otherwise unremarkable paperwork that had apparently never been cross-referenced against each other by anyone in an official capacity, spread as they were across multiple jurisdictions, multiple county lines, a genuine gap in institutional attention that I think, more than any single detail, explained how this pattern had persisted undetected for so long. I remember sitting up late one night with Thad, spreading printouts of all 11 files across my living room floor, physically arranging them by date and location, watching a map of that 40-mile stretch slowly fill with red pins, each one representing a person who had once had an ordinary, unremarkable life before that particular stretch of road swallowed them whole. Thad found the detail that finally gave us a real, actionable lead, a partial description, mentioned in exactly one of the 11 case files, from a witness who'd driven past the scene of a breakdown roughly an hour before the victim's last recorded communication, describing a tow truck, unmarked, no visible company branding, parked along the shoulder near the stranded vehicle. The witness hadn't thought much of it at the time, hadn't even mentioned it to police until nearly 2 months later during a follow-up canvass, by which point the detail had been logged, filed, and apparently never meaningfully pursued. Part 3. Detective Brandt. We took what we'd found to the state police, specifically to a detective named Ansel Brandt, who'd handled the 2 most recent cases on our list and who, we hoped, might have the institutional access and authority to actually act on a pattern that Thad and I, as private citizens with a podcast microphone, had no real ability to pursue further ourselves. I want to describe that first meeting carefully, because I think Brandt's initial reaction, cautious, professionally skeptical, but not dismissive, mattered considerably for what happened afterward. Brandt was in his late 40s, the kind of detective who'd clearly spent enough years on the job to have developed a healthy skepticism toward amateur theories brought to him by well-meaning members of the public, and I remember bracing myself, walking into that meeting, for exactly the kind of polite dismissal we'd received from 2 other jurisdictions before finally reaching him. It didn't come. He listened to our full presentation without interruption, examined our timeline and case comparisons with what I could tell was genuine, careful attention, and asked questions throughout that made clear he was actually testing the strength of our research rather than simply waiting for us to finish, so he could send us on our way. "I'm not going to pretend I haven't had my own suspicions about a pattern out there," he told us, sitting across a cramped conference table in the regional barracks, our printed timeline spread between us. "The problem is jurisdiction. That stretch of road crosses 3 counties. Every disappearance got logged separately, investigated separately, by different departments who had no particular reason to compare notes with each other. You two did something in a few weeks of internet research that should have happened institutionally 15 years ago, and I'm genuinely embarrassed it took an outside podcast to force that comparison. He was cautious about the tow truck details specifically, warning us both, in language I wish I'd taken more seriously at the time, that a single decade-old partial description from an uncertain witness was nowhere near sufficient to justify any kind of formal action, and that continuing to investigate on our own carried real risk if the pattern we'd identified was, in fact, real and active. If there's actually someone doing this, he said, and if they've been doing it successfully for 15 years without getting caught, that means they're careful, and it means they're paying attention to anything that might threaten that streak. A podcast episode naming a specific pattern along a specific road is exactly the kind of thing that might get their attention in ways neither of you are prepared to handle. I want to be honest that I did not fully heed that warning, and I think Thad, in the months since, has struggled with his own guilt over not pushing harder to stop me, though I've told him, repeatedly, that the decision to keep digging was entirely mine, made with full knowledge of the risk Brandt had just described. I remember leaving that meeting feeling, despite Brandt's caution, a genuine sense of validation. Someone with real authority had finally taken the pattern seriously, and that validation, I think, made it considerably easier to convince myself that the risk he described was more theoretical than immediate, a mistaken judgment I've had considerable time since to regret. We released our first episode covering the pattern 6 weeks after that meeting, carefully worded to avoid naming any specific suspect, framing it instead as a call for any additional witnesses who might have information about unmarked tow trucks operating along that stretch of road over the preceding 15 years. Part 4. The Tip. The episode did exactly what we'd hoped it would, in terms of generating new information, and exactly what Brandt had feared it might, in terms of consequence. Within a week of release, we'd received over 30 listener submissions, most of them well-meaning but unhelpful, the ordinary noise any true crime podcast generates when it opens a call for tips, people misremembering details from decades-old local news. Well-intentioned theories built on coincidence rather than evidence, the occasional message from someone clearly more interested in inserting themselves into an interesting story than actually contributing anything useful. Thad and I spent most evenings that week working through the backlog together, cross-referencing each submission against our existing timeline, mostly finding nothing, until one message, arriving 9 days after the episode dropped, stood apart from the rest immediately. It came from an email address with no identifying information, sent through our show's general contact form, and it contained a single attachment, a grainy, low-resolution photograph, clearly taken from inside a moving vehicle, showing an unmarked tow truck parked along a familiar-looking stretch of shoulder, a figure standing beside it whose face was mostly obscured by the angle and the photograph's poor quality, but whose build and posture were, at minimum, distinct enough to potentially match against any future suspect. The accompanying message read only, "I saw this 3 years ago and never said anything because I told myself it was nothing. I've read your episode 4 times now. I don't think it was nothing. I'm sorry it took me this long." I remember staring at that photograph for a long time, enlarging it as much as the resolution would allow, trying to make out any additional detail that might help identify the truck or the figure standing beside it, and I remember the specific electric mixture of excitement and dread that settled over both Thad and me, sitting together in my cramped home office late that night, understanding that we might genuinely be looking at the first real, physical evidence connecting a specific vehicle to this pattern in 15 years of scattered, disconnected investigation. Thad and I brought the photograph directly to Detective Brandt rather than attempting any further independent investigation ourselves, and I want to note, in fairness to both of us, that we genuinely believed, handing it over, that we'd done everything responsibly at that point, informed law enforcement at every step, avoided naming any specific suspect publicly, treated the entire investigation with what we believed was appropriate caution given Brandt's earlier warning. What we did not know, and would not learn until considerably later, was that our episode's release and the subsequent public call for tow truck information had already reached someone who understood exactly what it meant for his 15-year pattern. and who had, in the weeks since its release, begun paying very specific, very personal attention to the podcast host whose voice was narrating, in increasingly precise detail, information he had every reason to believe only he could have known. Part 5. Being watched. I noticed the first sign almost 2 weeks after the tip came in, and I want to describe it the way I've described similar early warning signs in other accounts I've heard from people who lived through something comparable, small, individually explicable, and only alarming in retrospect once a clearer pattern had fully revealed itself. My car, parked in its usual spot outside my apartment building, showed a small, fresh scratch along the rear bumper one morning that I had no memory of causing myself, the kind of minor damage that's easy to dismiss as an anonymous parking lot mishap. A careless neighbor backing out too quickly, nothing worth the anxiety I nonetheless felt looking at it. I remember standing in that parking lot, running my thumb along the scratch, telling myself the same reassuring story anyone would tell themselves in that moment. Cars get scratched. Parking lots are full of careless drivers. This has nothing to do with anything. I believed that story for almost a full week, right up until the second sign made it considerably harder to sustain. The second sign, roughly a week later, was harder to explain away. I'd left my apartment for an early morning run and returned to find my front door, which I was certain I'd locked, standing very slightly ajar, not forced, no sign of damage to the frame or the lock itself, simply open by perhaps an inch. The kind of detail that could plausibly be attributed to a lock not fully catching, except that I'd lived in that apartment for 4 years and had never once had that lock fail to catch properly before. I stood in that hallway for a long time before finally working up the nerve to push the door open, checking every room, every closet, finding nothing disturbed, no sign that anyone had actually entered beyond that single, unsettling inch of open space. I told Thad about both incidents, and I watched his expression shift into the same careful, concerned attention Brandt had shown weeks earlier, warning us about exactly this kind of consequence. "I think you need to tell Brandt," he said, and I did, that same afternoon, and Brandt's response, this time, carried none of his earlier measured caution. "I want you to consider staying somewhere else for a while," he told me, his voice tighter than I'd heard it in our previous meetings. "I want you to vary your routine, your routes, anything predictable about your daily movement. And I want you to understand that if the person we're looking for has genuinely started paying attention to you specifically, the 2 small incidents you've described are very likely just the beginning of a pattern he's used successfully and repeatedly for 15 years. I did not fully heed that advice either, not completely, not at first. I want to be honest about that, because I think the specific, stubborn refusal to fully disrupt my own life in response to a threat I still couldn't entirely prove was real is a mistake I've seen echoed in nearly every account like mine I've since encountered, the particular, dangerous human tendency to underweight a threat until it becomes undeniable, precisely because fully accommodating it feels, in the moment, like giving up too much of an ordinary life you're not yet ready to surrender. I kept most of my regular routine intact over the following 2 weeks, telling myself I was simply being more alert rather than genuinely changing anything substantial, a distinction that felt, at the time, like a reasonable compromise and that I now recognize as its own kind of dangerous denial. Part 6. The Breakdown. I want to describe the night everything escalated as precisely and honestly as I can, because I've relived it more times than any other memory I currently hold, and because I think the specific details matter for understanding both how close I came to becoming the 12th name on that list, and how, ultimately, the very research that had put me in danger also gave me the tools to survive it. I was driving back from a recorded interview with one of the victim's family members, a woman named Corliss Okereke whose brother had vanished along the Hollow Road 9 years earlier, and I want to describe that interview briefly, because I think it matters for understanding my state of mind that evening. Corliss had spent 2 hours walking me through her brother's final weeks, his last known movements, the specific agony of 9 years without answers, and I remember leaving her home that afternoon carrying a heaviness I hadn't fully processed, distracted. I think in ways that made me considerably less careful about my own route home than I should have been. My route home, against every piece of advice Brandt had given me about varying my patterns, took me directly along that same 40-mile stretch, a decision I'd made partly out of simple time pressure and partly, I think, out of a stubborn, foolish confidence that daylight and a full tank of gas made the risk manageable. It was nearly dusk by the time my car's engine began making a sound I didn't immediately recognize, a rough, uneven cough that grew steadily worse over the following mile until the engine died entirely, coasting to a stop along a shoulder I recognized, with a specific, sinking dread, as falling almost exactly within the geographic cluster of our original 11 cases. I remember the specific silence that settled over the car in that first moment, engine dead, hazard lights ticking, the forest pressing close on both sides of that narrow shoulder, and I remember checking my phone immediately, finding, as expected given everything we already knew about that stretch of road, only a single flickering bar of signal, enough, I hoped desperately, to make one call before it disappeared entirely. I called Thad first, not emergency services, a decision I've questioned since, but that felt, in the panic of the moment, like the fastest path to someone who'd actually understand the full context of what might be happening. I told him where I was, what had happened, and I remember the specific quality of his voice, urgent but controlled, telling me to stay in the car, doors locked, and that he was calling Brandt immediately while staying on the line with me. It was during that call, watching my rearview mirror with an attention that felt, at the time, like simple prudent caution, that I saw the tow truck approaching, unmarked, exactly matching the description from our anonymous tip, slowing as it drew alongside my stopped vehicle. I remember the specific, paralyzing moment of decision that followed, whether to stay locked inside my car, waiting for help that Brandt's team, even moving as fast as possible, was still a genuine distance away, or whether the driver's approach, entirely ordinary on its surface, a stranger simply stopping to help a stranded motorist, was actually the beginning of exactly the pattern that had already claimed 11 lives along this same stretch of road. Part 7. Emmerich Thorne. I did not roll down my window. I want that decision documented clearly, because I believe, with a certainty that has only grown since, that it is the single choice that kept me alive that evening. I stayed inside my locked car, engine dead, Thad still on the line, watching a man climb down from that unmarked tow truck's cab and approach my driver's side window with an easy, practiced friendliness that, under any other circumstances, might have looked exactly like ordinary rural hospitality. He was, I'd later learn, a man named Emmerich Thorne, 51 years old, a longtime local resident who had worked, for over 2 decades, in a semi-official capacity assisting the county's road maintenance department, a role that gave him legitimate, unquestioned familiarity with that entire stretch of highway and, crucially, a genuine, believable reason to be driving an unmarked service vehicle along it at any hour, day or night, without ever drawing the kind of attention a stranger's vehicle would have. I did not know any of that yet, in that moment. I knew only that a stranger was approaching my stopped car at dusk, on the exact stretch of road 11 other people had vanished from, and that everything Brandt had warned us about had apparently, catastrophically, come true. He knocked gently on my window, smiling, asking if I needed a hand, and I remember the specific, uncanny wrongness of studying his face through the glass, searching for any visible sign of the monster I'd spent months building a theoretical profile of, and finding instead exactly what every one of his previous victims had presumably found, an unremarkable, weathered, entirely ordinary man, the kind of face that belongs to 1,000 harmless rural strangers, offering help along a lonely road at exactly the moment help seems most needed. He wore a faded work jacket with no visible company insignia, the kind of unbranded, generic uniform that would raise no immediate suspicion in a stranded motorist's mind, and I understood, watching him, that this was itself a deliberate choice. A costume assembled carefully over years to project exactly the right blend of competence and harmlessness. I told him, through the glass, that help was already on the way, that I appreciated the offer but was fine waiting, and I watched something shift, very slightly, Behind his eyes, not dramatic, not an obvious mask slipping, simply a small, cold recalibration that I recognized, with a certainty that still frightens me recalling it, as the exact moment he understood I was not simply a stranded motorist he'd happened upon by chance. "You're the podcast lady," he said, his voice still carrying that same easy, friendly cadence, entirely unchanged despite the words themselves. "I thought that might be you, seeing you out here alone like this. Funny coincidence, isn't it, given everything you've been asking around about lately?" I remember the specific horror of that moment, understanding that he had not simply encountered me by chance, that he had recognized my car, or my face, or some detail I still don't fully understand, and that whatever was happening in that moment was not an opportunistic breakdown he'd stumbled onto, but something he had, at minimum, been prepared for, possibly for weeks. Part 8. The longest 12 minutes. I want to walk through the following minutes as precisely as I can, because I've been asked to give this exact account, in far more clinical detail, to investigators, to a grand jury, and eventually, I expect, to a trial jury. And because I think the precision itself matters for anyone who might one day find themselves in a similarly isolated, similarly dangerous position. Thorne did not immediately turn violent. He remained outside my locked car, still smiling, still speaking in that same unhurried, conversational tone, telling me, with a calm that made my blood run cold, that he'd been following our podcast's coverage closely, that he respected the thoroughness of our research even as he found it, in his words, a genuine inconvenience to a system that's worked out just fine for a long time now. I remember, listening to him talk, forcing myself to catalog every detail I could, his exact wording, his posture, the specific tools visible in the bed of his truck, some instinct telling me, even in the depth of my fear, that if I survived this, every observed detail might eventually matter. He spoke almost conversationally about the pattern we'd uncovered, never fully confirming his own involvement, but never quite denying it either, a careful, practiced ambiguity that I understood, even then, was its own kind of psychological control, keeping me uncertain enough about his actual intentions that I might still, against every rational instinct, consider rolling down that window. He tried the driver's side handle once, gently, almost casually, as though testing rather than genuinely expecting it to open, and when it didn't, he simply stepped back, unhurried, and told me, in the same friendly tone, that he had tools in his truck that could get a stubborn door open faster than most people expected, that there was no need to make this more difficult than it needed to be. I remember the specific, desperate clarity of that moment, understanding, with total certainty, that whatever calm reasonableness he was performing was simply a more patient, more practiced version of exactly the same manipulation that had, presumably, worked on 11 people before me, each of whom had likely made some version of the same calculation I was now making, weighing the apparent ordinariness of a stranger's offered help against a fear that felt, in the moment, difficult to fully justify. Thad, still on the line, had by that point reached Brandt directly, and I could hear, faintly, through my own phone, the sound of Thad relaying my location, my situation, with a controlled urgency that I clung to as my only tether to the possibility of actual rescue. I did not hang up. I kept that line open the entire time, narrating, quietly, every movement Thorne made outside my car, understanding, even in my panic, that whatever record I could provide might matter enormously if this ended badly. I remember my own voice, shaking, describing his truck's license plate, his clothing, the specific tools he'd mentioned, a running account that Thad later told me he'd been simultaneously relaying to Brandt's dispatch in real time, a small, desperate chain of communication that I believe, genuinely, helped Brandt's team close the distance faster than they otherwise would have. It was the sound of a second vehicle's engine, approaching fast from the direction I'd originally been driving, that finally changed the calculation outside my window. I watched Thorne's expression shift again, that same cold recalibration, weighing, I believe, the diminishing odds of completing whatever he'd originally intended against the escalating risk of being caught in the act by whatever backup was now clearly, audibly approaching. He did not run. He simply turned, unhurried even in that final moment, climbed back into his truck's cab, and pulled away with the same easy, unremarkable confidence he'd arrived with, gone entirely from view by the time Brandt's patrol vehicle actually reached my stopped car less than 90 seconds later. Part 9. The Arrest. Brandt's team located Thorne's truck within the hour, pulled over on a state highway roughly 20 miles from where he'd approached me, and I want to describe the specific, complicated relief of learning that arrest had actually happened, because I think it's rarely as clean or as immediately satisfying as fiction tends to portray it. I remember sitting in the back of Brandt's own patrol vehicle, wrapped in a blanket someone had handed me, shaking in a way I couldn't fully control, listening to radio traffic confirm the arrest while still not quite able to believe, in that first hour, that the danger had genuinely passed. He did not confess immediately. He maintained, for the first several hours of questioning, according to what Brandt later shared with me, an entirely plausible account of simple, good-faith roadside assistance. A story that might genuinely have held up if not for the physical evidence investigators found over the following days, once a search warrant gave them full access to his truck, his property, and a storage unit registered under a relative's name that Thorne had apparently believed no one would ever think to search. I remember Brandt calling me days later, his voice carrying a specific, weary gravity, to tell me what that search had uncovered, and I remember bracing myself, even before he said a word, for something I already understood was going to be considerably worse than anything I'd allowed myself to imagine. I'm not going to describe everything investigators found in that storage unit, because I don't think a detailed accounting serves any purpose except causing further pain to families who have already suffered more than enough, but I will say this, it was sufficient, combined with the physical evidence recovered from his truck itself, to conclusively connect him to at least 7 of our original 11 cases, with strong circumstantial evidence suggesting involvement in the remaining 4 as well. Detective Brandt told me, in a phone call I will never forget, that the department's forensic accounting of that storage unit represented, in his 22 years on the force, the single most methodical, most patient pattern of predation he had ever personally encountered. Thorne's eventual statement to investigators, portions of which Brandt shared with me once the case moved toward trial, described his methods with a clinical detachment that disturbed everyone who reviewed it. He had, for over 15 years, deliberately sabotaged a small, carefully selected set of vehicles he'd serviced through his legitimate road maintenance role, planting minor mechanical vulnerabilities that would reliably fail within a predictable window, specifically along the isolated, cell signal-dead stretch of road his official duties gave him unquestioned reason to patrol regularly. He selected his targets, according to his own account, based on a combination of isolation, apparent lack of immediate local connections, and a detail that made my stomach turn hearing it, a specific, practiced instinct for identifying travelers unlikely to be reported missing quickly enough for any meaningful search to begin before he'd had time to fully cover his tracks. Brandt told me that reading through that statement, seeing 15 years of calculated, patient predation reduced to the same flat, procedural language a mechanic might use describing routine maintenance, was one of the more disturbing documents he'd encountered in his entire career. Part 10. What's left? Thorne is currently awaiting trial, held without bail given both the severity and the number of charges against him, and I want to be honest that the process of preparing to testify, of sitting across from prosecutors reviewing every detail of that evening along the hollow road, has been considerably harder than I anticipated when I first agreed to help however the case needed me to. I have spoken with several of the victims' family members since the arrest, including Corliss Okereke, whose interview I was driving home from on the night Thorne approached me, and I want to describe the specific, complicated weight of those conversations. Genuine gratitude, mixed with a grief that finding an answer after so many years could never fully resolve. Corliss told me, the last time we spoke, that knowing what happened to her brother didn't bring him back, didn't undo 9 years of wondering, but that it had, at least, let her finally stop imagining every possible version of his fate and settle, painfully, into the one that was actually true. Case Cold has continued, though I've made changes to how we approach ongoing investigations that I think, honestly, should have been in place from the very beginning. We no longer publicly release specific geographic or methodological details while a pattern remains active and unconfirmed by law enforcement. We coordinate considerably more closely and considerably earlier with actual investigators rather than treating our own research as parallel rather than subordinate to official processes. I've had to sit with real discomfort about how much of what I did right and how much I simply got lucky in surviving an encounter that 11 other people did not survive before me. Dad and I have talked at length about whether we would have made different choices knowing what we know now, and I don't think either of us has a fully satisfying answer to that question. The investigation genuinely helped identify and stop someone who might otherwise still be operating along that road today, and it also very nearly cost me my life, and I don't think those two facts resolve into any clean, comfortable lesson about how citizen journalism should or shouldn't engage with active danger. I still drive that stretch of road occasionally, when routes leave me no reasonable alternative, and I want to be honest that I don't know if that specific fear will ever fully fade, regardless of how the eventual trial resolves. I check my rearview mirror more than I used to. I keep my doors locked reflexively now, even for short trips, even in daylight, even in neighborhoods I've lived in for years without a single previous incident. That tells me this is simply what surviving something like this costs, that the vigilance doesn't disappear just because the specific threat has been removed, and I've come to believe he's right. Though understanding that intellectually and actually living with it day to day remain, I've found, two very different challenges. I've started seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma related to violent crime, and she's told me, gently, that what I'm experiencing is an entirely ordinary response to an entirely extraordinary threat. A reassurance I find myself needing to hear repeated more often than I'd like to admit. If there's a single piece of advice I can offer anyone reading this, it's this: the ordinary, practiced kindness of a stranger offering help along an isolated road is not, in itself, evidence of safety. However uncomfortable that fact might be to sit with. Trust your own instinct for wrongness over a stranger's easy, convincing friendliness, especially somewhere no one else can see or hear what happens next. Keep your doors locked. Stay on the phone with someone who knows exactly where you are. And if you ever find yourself stranded on a lonely stretch of road, waiting for real help to arrive, remember that the most dangerous thing you can do is assume that whoever stops first is automatically who they appear to be. 11 people made a different calculation than I did, on that same stretch of road, over 15 patient, careful years. I think about them more than I think about almost anything else now, and I have decided, going forward, that whatever this podcast becomes, their names are the reason I intend to keep doing this work at all, though considerably more carefully, and considerably more humbly, than I ever did before that evening the tow truck slowed to a stop beside my own stranded car.